In this video, I want to talk about a recent paper which tried to link the Catholic Church's policies, whereby it banned cousin marriages and insisted that new marriages lead to new homes and nuclear families as opposed to extended kin networks. It linked these church policies to certain psychological and sociological features of Western societies, specifically the tendency of Western societies to score highly on measures of individualism, on measures of nonconformity, and on measures of pro-social behavior towards people that are not one's kin. At a theoretical level, the relationship between these things and family structure is fairly obvious. After all, in an individualistic society, people interact with others primarily based on their individual characteristics and not based on whether or not they are members of one's family. After all, it wouldn't be easy to live a life based primarily on associations with one's family in a society in which families were broken down into very small units, because you just need more people than that to interact with in order to get around and function. Now, while interacting with such people, of course, you're going to need to get along with them, and so we see the connection between these sorts of family structures on the one hand and pro-social behavior towards non-kin on the other hand. And at the same time, when we talk about conformity and respect for authority and tradition and this sort of thing, we can see how this sort of thing would be selected for in a society in which people were organized into kin groups, because your life very much will revolve around familial hierarchies and elders who are literally related to you that you would be expected to look up to. Now, the paper went and tested these theoretical relationships by examining how variation in historical experience with the church, as measured by the number of years that a given area was under the sway of the Catholic Church prior to the year 1500, how variation in that kind of church history predicted current variation in these psychological and sociological variables. Now, of course, the idea here is that this effect was mediated by or explained by the church's effect on cousin marriage rates and on family structure, and so they needed a measure of those things as well. So they gathered a data set of cousin marriage rates by country and an index of kinship intensity, which would measure things like the propensity of a society to organize around clans, or the extent to which families tended to live together as extended families rather than nuclear families, etc. And they found pretty tight correlations, actually extremely tight correlations, between all of these things. Exposure to the Western Church historically predicted individualism, pro-sociality, and nonconformity quite well. Exposure to the Eastern Church predicted these values not nearly as well. Their kinship intensity index predicted these things moderately well in most cases, but it is worth emphasizing that even better than the kinship intensity index as a predictor of these outcomes was just the cousin marriage rate in most instances. Now, if church exposure is highly correlated with these outcomes, and so is cousin marriage rates, then if church exposure had its effect on these outcomes via cousin marriage rates, you would hope that church exposure itself was highly correlated with cousin marriage rates, and in fact it was. They were extremely well correlated, such that an additional 500 years of exposure to the Catholic Church predicted a 92% reduction in cousin marriage rates. Now, the paper tried to rule out several alternative explanations, because you might say that there are other reasons for which the West tends to be more individualistic, less conformist, more pro-social than exposure to the Catholic Church and a mediating influence on cousin marriage rates. And there are certain evolutionary theories about the prevalence of parasites and pathogens in an area, which seek to explain variation in these sorts of variables at the national level, and so they controlled for that. They also controlled for the sort of ecological variables that a Jared Diamond type might care about, things like the suitability for certain kinds of agriculture or the time since agriculture developed in an area. They also controlled for race, and none of these things made the associations go away in their regression models. Exposure to the Catholic Church continued to predict all of these socio-psychological outcomes even after controlling for all of these things. Now, they conducted another analysis where they broke Europe down into 440 subregions and then looked at whether or not differences between those 440 subregions in terms of historic church exposure predicted differences between those 440 subregions in these psychosocial variables, and in fact, in each case, it did. And then they looked at immigrants. They asked the question, can we predict how individuals tend to score on these sorts of measures based on the degree of historic church exposure present in the country from which their parents came? And the answer to that, across 12 tests in each case, was yes. Now, generally speaking, the impact of exposure to the Orthodox Church was either negligible or weaker than, but in the same direction as, exposure to the Catholic Church. But this was not true with respect to traditionalism. When you go in and ask people on a survey how important it is to uphold traditional values, these two churches had opposite but almost equally strong effects, where historic exposure to the Orthodox Church increases the importance of traditionalism, while historic exposure to the Catholic Church does the opposite. And I bring this up just to note that this is consistent with data that I've reviewed before showing that the degree of Catholicism in a country positively correlates with left-wing views on sexuality and family. And this may be part of why, though I doubt it is the entire explanation. In any case, in general, this hypothesis seems pretty well supported that the Church influenced Western psychology via its influence on family structure and mating patterns. Now, that effect could be cultural in nature or it could be genetic in nature. The paper addresses this. Initially, they say that they are agnostic about this. Now, the effect persists in the children of immigrants, so it is some kind of inheritance, but they say that their paper is agnostic with respect to whether or not that inheritance is cultural or genetic. Now, even though they express this agnosticism, they go on to make an argument against the genetic view. They say that genes are unlikely to be the mechanism at play here because, after all, church exposure is fairly recent in history, and because church exposure differences between groups within the same nation led to psychological differences between groups within the same nation. In each case, this reasoning is totally fallacious. In the first case, it is just shown very simply through arithmetic that large differences in evolution can occur over the span of, say, 500 years, 1,000 years, even in the presence of fairly small and weak selective pressures, so long as those selective pressures are consistent across generations. So just as an example, if only 20% of the variance in a trait is due to genes, and generally this figure is more like 50% for psychological traits, but if it was only 20%, and the difference in the correlation between that trait and fertility between two populations was only 0.1, after 20 generations, this alone will lead to almost half a standard deviation of difference between the groups due to genetics. This is the result of a simple application of the Breeder's equation. Now, with respect to the idea that this can't be due to genes because, after all, it explains variation within nations, this seems to imply that there cannot be genetic variation within a nation, which of course is not true. Now, when the authors made these comments, they had one particular kind of genetic mechanism in mind. Specifically, it was arguing that the sort of society that the West created, thanks in part to the Church, selected for a different kind of individual than would have been selected for in a more traditional, conformist, and collectivist society. So, for instance, in a kin-based collectivist society, there may not be much in the way of selection against a tendency to only trust people you're biologically related to, because after all, that's the sort of person you're mostly going to be interacting with anyhow, whereas in a more individualistic society, well, things might be quite different. That is a fine genetic mechanism to consider, but it is not the only one, and I think the paper errs, therefore, in only considering that one genetic mechanism. So, I want to bring forward two different genetic mechanisms they don't seem to have considered. The first one is this, that through kin selection, collectivist societies will breed in-group favoritism. So to understand this, we first have to understand the idea of kin selection, which is quite simple. It basically says that a gene can be selected for by evolution if that gene favors copies of itself, even if it does not favor the organism within which a particular gene is located. So, for instance, a gene which causes someone to sacrifice themselves in order to save the lives of, say, 3 siblings and 2 parents, well, that gene is going to be selected for, clearly, because via that one person dying, it saved more than one copy of itself, and so it is now more frequent in the population than it would have been had the person allowed their siblings and parents to perish. Generally, this sort of explanation is offered by biologists for one mode of altruism. This is not the only kind of altruism, but one kind of altruism is explained by this process of kin selection, and people are systematically more altruistic towards people the more related they are to them. We see this within families, comparing second cousins, first cousins, grandparents, parents, and siblings and half-siblings, and we see that this is true even when controlling for how much contact people have had with these various relatives. In fact, there is a theory called genetic similarity theory, which posits that this kind of thing is involved in a much larger network than just someone's formal family. So what is the evidence for this? In the first place, people's friends are more genetically related to them than they would be if people were selecting friends at random. On average, friends are about as related as fourth cousins. Secondly, if you assemble a data set of a ton of different variables, we're talking about anthropomorphic traits like your height or your wrist size, etc., or psychological variables or answers to a political survey, and you organize these variables in terms of their heritability, what you'll see is that the more heritable these traits are, the more it is true that friends and mates tend to be similar with respect to them. And then on top of this, you also see that the more heritable a trait is, there's a slight tendency for it to be true that the more heritable the trait is, the more similarity in that trait predicts success in a marriage. And so there's some evidence that even outside of formal families, people act more altruistically and pro-socially towards people the more related to them they are, and there is very strong evidence, both in humans and in non-humans, as a general principle of biology, that within families, this is certainly true. And this goes a long way to explain why people are so biased in favor of their family members. And this kind of familial bias, which I'm going to say is exaggerated in more collectivistic kin-based societies, is antithetical to pro-social behavior towards people you're not related to. Even in our societies, people think that nepotism is a problem sometimes. But it's not that big of a problem because, for one thing, we don't have that many relatives that we know to be biased in favor of. And in the second place, people are biased in favor of their family members, but unless they're really closely related to them, they're normally not that biased. A collectivist kin network-based society changes both of these factors. In the first place, it surrounds people with people they know they are related to, and it expands who they consider to be in a meaningful way in their family. And in the second place, through multiple generations of inbreeding, it makes it so that, for instance, their cousins and second cousins become more genetically related to them than cousins and second cousins will be in the context of a more individualistic society. Now, this fact has serious political consequences. For instance, this is going to increase corruption because, in the first place, large kin networks will work in their own interest rather than in the national interest, and in the second place, it is going to increase the probability that any given person will have relatives in the government who they are close enough with such that they can utilize that connection for a corrupt purpose. And this isn't just theory, there's empirical support for this. Empirically, nearly half of the variance in how well nations score on measures of corruption can be explained by national variance in the prevalence of cousin marriage rates. And this association continues to persist once we control for economic, ecological, and religious variation between these countries. Aside from corruption, another effect of this sort of genetic fractionalization of society is that people may be less likely to support the notion of universal human rights, because, again, obviously, they're operating in a mode of bias in favor of not the national group, but the kin group. And there is, again, empirical support for this. A 2018 paper found that roughly a third of the variance in how well nations uphold human rights can be accounted for by variance in national rates of marriage between cousins. In fact, a 2012 paper showed that the relationship between Islam, the prevalence of Muslims in a country, on the one hand, and scores on democratic values in a country on the other, that this association can mostly be explained by Islam's association with cousin marriage rates. Now note that this explanation is about a change in the genetic structure of society, but it is not about the increase of genetic variants that select for in-group favoritism, because Western people would act in some of the same ways if they were surrounded by large kin networks, and those kin networks were more related to them than our relatives currently are. Of course, that is not to say that the selection mechanism did not happen as well, and that these two things haven't worked together. I think they probably have, but I'm just stressing that these are two different explanations. And then, of course, there's a third explanation, the most obvious explanation, which is that cousin marriage rates impact the psychology of an area by influencing the rate of inbreeding depression. Now, I'm not sure how this would relate to many of the variables that the paper directly considers, but I do know that this is going to relate to IQ, because several studies have shown, and it is generally well known, that the more inbred someone is, the lower their IQ tends to be, and these differences are actually very large in many cases. And again, this is empirically attested to. There is a direct correlation between the cousin marriage rate of a country and its IQ score. There's even evidence that historic differences in inbreeding rates play a role in racial differences in intelligence, because if you take an IQ test and you break it into the different cognitive abilities it measures, and then you rank those cognitive abilities in terms of how strongly impacted they are by inbreeding, the more strongly impacted a given cognitive ability is by inbreeding, the more blacks and whites tend to differ in that cognitive ability. The effect of inbreeding on other psychological variables is less well known. Of course, there's going to be some effect because the brain regions involved in intelligence are not intelligence-specific brain regions that doesn't exist. They're involved in all sorts of psychological mechanisms. But as I say, this is an understudied area. There was a 2017 paper worth mentioning which found that a whole range of psychological pathologies were more common in inbred children. And so we have three different mechanisms: selection, genetic fractionalization, and inbreeding, by which Western psychology was plausibly and probably impacted by the church's policies concerning cousin marriages. And this paper highlights a particularly strong argument for genetic differences between groups in intelligence, because to deny this, you would have to do something like denying that there are historic differences in inbreeding rates between populations, which is insane, or denying that inbreeding impacts people's intelligence, which is insane. You basically only have insane options to get out of this. And so I think a key takeaway from this paper is not only that the church impacted Western psychology through its cultural impact, but also that the influences it had on cousin marriage rates probably influenced us genetically in a range of different ways, which are of political, economic, and social importance, and which differentiate Western people genetically from the rest of the world.